The Florida legislature is in the midst of making some of the ugliest special interest sausage you've ever seen. We're going to tell you exactly how they're doing it coming up next. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. So this is going to be an update from day 57 of the Florida legislature's 2025 legislative session, which will last for God knows how many days this year. The legislature in Florida here, we are supposed to have an annual 60-day legislative session, but we all sort of knew this already, but it became official that Florida lawmakers will not finish up their work by day 60 of this year's session. Now, whether or not that means extending into the next week or coming back for a summer in Tallahassee, a June special session, perhaps a post-Memorial Day special session, that seems to be on the cards. You know, just to give folks a little bit of state of play. And I mean, this is the level of detail that only true sickos really care about. But, you know, the one constitutionally, Florida lawmakers, the one thing they have to do every year is pass a new state budget. And usually there's also a constitutional requirement that whenever they agree on a final state budget, it has to sit for 72 hours before they can vote on it. I assume the idea here is people need time, give people time to actually read the budget before they pass it. So in a normal legislative session, today, day 57, is the key day. This is the Tuesday of the final week of session. This is when the budget has to be on members' desks, figuratively speaking. Technology has evolved since then, if they're going to get the budget voted out on day 60 and be able to go home. But, you know, they long ago blew through that deadline. There was some thought that maybe they could still get a budget, because right now they're still in a situation where they haven't begun the process. Both the House and Senate have both passed budgets, but they're like $5 billion apart on the top line numbers. This is mostly because the House is pushing a giant statewide sales tax cut that's carries like a $5 billion price tag. And like that right there is basically your budget difference. And so they haven't been able to even begin the process of negotiating a final state budget because they haven't been able to agree on how much money they have to spend, right? They can't, again, this is for true sickos, but this is called allocations, basically. And so the House, before final budget negotiations can begin, the House and Senate leadership, the House Speaker and the Senate President, have to agree to allocations for essentially each, continuing to talk to sickos here, each silo of the budget, you know, the healthcare section of the budget, the transportation section of the budget, the education section, that sort of thing. So normally you would agree to these allocations, and then there's like a week of budget negotiations that happen. They call them conference committee meetings. So normally you want these wrapped up. This needs to be wrapped up by Tuesday for today for the budget to get out. We long ago knew that they weren't going to get that part done, but there was still some hope that maybe they could agree on numbers. They could agree on allocations and begin this conference process this week while they're still in town for the regular session, you know, and maybe, you know, miracle of all miracles, get a budget agreed to by Friday, you know, while everybody's here. And then it's got to sit there for 72 hours anyway. So you can't touch it anyway. You could sort of basically wrap up and then just come back into town sometime next week and just have a vote on the budget. That has happened at least one time in my experience covering the legislature where basically if they went away and they came back to town like the following Monday or Tuesday of the next week and just like gabbled in, voted out the budget, and went home, basically. That is now off the table. They're not going to have a budget done in time to the point where they can do any sort of meaningful conferencing this week. And assuming that they want to stick to conference, the conference process is one of those. It really is largely like kabuki theater. Most of these decisions are being made behind closed doors by the leadership, but it's one of those things you have to do to sort of like maintain the fiction that the story everybody likes to tell, that this is a member-driven process. So if you assume that they want to do a conference process, there's just no way to get that done and get a budget wrapped up before everybody is before day 60 anyway. So they've lost even kind of that deadline of still getting the budget done by day 60 and then just having to come back for one quick vote after that. So it seems to me that without the Tuesday deadline now, with that blown, and without the Friday deadline, there's not really anything now to sort of force a deal to come together, and everything can change late sessions. Chances are I get off the microphone and like find out, oh, they pulled it out of a ditch or something like that. But from where it looks at right now, there's not anything to provide pressure on this situation for a while. The next kind of deadline is July 1st, the start of the next fiscal year. That's when that's the true drop deadline there. You don't have a budget by then. I mean, I'm not even sure what that means in Florida. I assume that would mean a government shutdown, but maybe there are people who have lived through that experience. I don't know. I can't imagine it will come to that in a state where it's one party supermajority control, but it wouldn't surprise me if we're looking at like coming back here in June or something, and when that July 1st deadline is hanging out, and that's what negotiates. So that's what Senate finally forces some compromise. So, one of the wrinkles in all of this is it kind of leaves all this policy in play, all the stuff we've been talking about on these podcasts for the last, 2 months. Not all of it is directly budget related, but the reality is the budget is such a central focus of the Florida legislature and the work they do, and kind of the chips you use to like bring people along on votes and to trade favors. It's just a central part of the horse trading that happens, that all policy really is linked to that. I mean, if leadership has their priorities, right? Some of those priorities are budget related, some of them are policy related, but you might trade a budget issue for a policy issue, that sort of thing. So it becomes really hard to separate those two from an end game of session. So one of the more sort of fascinating questions of this week at this point is how they kind of square that circle. Do they try and separate policy and do a bunch of policy stuff before the end of the week? Do they let basically everything die and then try and bring it all back in kind of like what would be a kind of a mini regular session done in a special session, but like that whose scope is so wide that it's almost like a mini session? Yeah, I don't know. This is kind of a new territory for me. I can't remember a time where they seemed so far apart on a budget, at a point where they've already acknowledged they're not going to get it done on time. So, who knows? We'll see. Like I said, things can change on a dime, but that's kind of the state of the play as of Tuesday afternoon. Oh, by the way, I'm doing a new thing with the podcast this week, and normally I record these in the morning and then post them, recapping the past day. Because we're in the last week and things change so much, I'm kind of just doing these in the afternoon this week, and then I'll try and get them up by the evening. But we're still looking. Things could change, but we're in this kind of weird period where there's like a whole big pileup of bills waiting to pass or waiting to get negotiated or final deals on stuff. That part itself is not unusual. Usually this stuff all piles up until the very end, except now that there may not be an end, right? So who knows what's going to happen there? That's not to say that nothing is happening. So I wanted to talk about just a couple of really kind of interesting and farcical things that happened today in the legislature, and that kind of illustrate some of just the gross special interest sausage making that happens in this process, and the parts they left out of Schoolhouse Rock. So if folks listen to this podcast, they might remember that we flagged a bill last week. There was this random bill moving through the legislature dealing with mitigation banks. It's like, talk about arcane. That's even arcane for me. I'm a guy, and I've made multiple references to sickos in this podcast. Ain't nobody more sicko for arcane legislation than I am. And even mitigation banks are like, please, no, don't make me even look at that. Anyway, last week the Senate sort of cryptically took this obscure little bill, made kind of a non-significant change to the actual bill, but as part of this amendment, they broadened the title from an act relating to mitigation banks to an act relating to land development. And why that matters is because the Constitution requires that, a bill has to be comprised of subjects that all relate to each other. Basically, it has to be a single subject, essentially, although the subject can be broad. But so they took a bill that was very narrow and made it incredibly broad, which was like a telltale sign that leadership had plans to use that bill as a vehicle for some other amendment. Well, today we got a clue of at least what part of the plan is here. The Senate took a bill that we have talked about in this past, that a bill that is for the Mosaic Company. That's the mining and fertilizer giant that mines for phosphate ore in the southwest central part of the state, kind of south of Tampa Bay, essentially. Um, this is a bill we've written about on the show before, or we've written about on the newsletter, and we've talked about on the show before. But like basic gist of it is it would provide legal defenses to the Mosaic Company against claims stemming from radioactivity in ground that it in land that it is mined for phosphate, and that it is, sort of restored and like turned over to like housing development or other sort of stuff. The the phosphate mining process leaves behind kind of elevated levels of radiation in the ground. Now, there's arguments about sort of how high that elevated level is, whether or not it's still within safe levels and stuff like that. I'll throw the story you wrote before session about this bill into the show notes in case anybody wants to read more. Anyway, so there's this bill for the Mosaic Company. Um, it has been pretty clear from the beginning of session that this was probably a big priority for Senate President Ben Albritton, who's a Republican down in Wauchula, Florida, kind of very near to kind of phosphate country in Florida, and a guy who has gone to bat for Mosaic in different ways in the past. I seem to recall one time reading a story about a county commission in one of the Southwest Florida coastal counties, like passing a resolution to like ban phosphate mining within their county or something like that. Maybe it was to ban gyp stacks, which are part of the pollution problem that phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing produces, and that Ben Albritton showed up at this meeting or wrote a letter or something like urging them not to do it. So he's a guy that has been, very, very helpful to Mosaic in the past. It was pretty clear that this was a bill. The original bill was Senate Bill 832, came out of the Senate. It was pretty clear that this was a bill he cared a lot about. Um, and the House last week, I believe it was, kind of took that bill and hijacked it. Essentially, I think we have talked about this on the show. They essentially took the Mosaic bill and stuck a bunch of attorney like litigation. Essentially, they put language on the bill that would make it easier for homeowners to sue an insurance company that doesn't pay claims. Right, basically, kind of like not completely undoing, but like going back towards consumers, undoing a little bit of what DeSantis and the Governor Ron DeSantis, the legislature, did a couple of years ago in terms of essentially stripping consumers of basically all ability, any meaningful ability to sue an insurance company that doesn't pay claims. And they did that, of course, under the name of trying to reduce costs for insurance companies in hopes that would lead to lower rates. Hasn't really led to significantly lower rates, has left consumers in a really tough spot when an insurance company is being particularly recalcitrant. Anyway, the House is looking to undo some of that stuff and kind of, again, restore a little bit of legal ammunition to consumers. And they stuck that bill, they stuck that insurance attorney stuff onto the Mosaic bill and sent it back to the Senate. And of course, Ben Albritton has been pretty hostile to the idea of going backwards on some of this insurance stuff. Another thing to note here: the number 2 senator right now, a Republican from Southwest Florida by the name of Jim Boyd, was the sponsor of the insurance overhaul they did in December 2022, is I think when it was. So, pretty clear that going backwards on litigation type stuff, especially, was probably dead on arrival in the Senate. So if you're the Senate, you could always just take that bill back up, strip out the attorney stuff, and send it back to the House, and then just, I guess, ping pong back and forth, maybe call their bluff. But what the Senate decided to do instead is take this mitigation banking bill that had been cryptically expanded, and they stuck the Mosaic bill onto that. Now they've just punted that over to the Senate. Now this is an act relating to land development, and so now the House can't now turn around and stick a bunch of property insurance legislation onto it now. So again, trying to sort of game out the system, or work the chess match to essentially get this Mosaic bill passed. And we saw another example of this today with a different bill that we have talked a little bit about, although honestly we haven't paid a ton of attention to. Partially, well, let me explain it first. There is a bill that had been moving through the legislature earlier this session, and was filed the year before, that would essentially prohibit cities and counties, all local communities across Florida, from doing any kind of regulation of any kind of plastic or single-use food container or bag. So we're talking about like plastic bags, plastic cups, styrofoam food clamshells, those sorts of things. It would essentially, there have been pushes in a lot of communities to try and ban some of these things because they're enormous sources of litter. And so the legislature was working on a bill pushed by, broadly speaking, by a bunch of business groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the Florida Retail Federation, the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. I suspect Publix supermarkets is a big interest in this. I'll elaborate on that in just a sec, why I suspect that. But anyway, this bill had been moving along to strip essentially strip local communities of any ability to regulate these kind of single-use food containers and bags and stuff. The bill seemed to have been stuck, especially in that it made it all the way through the Senate again, but that it got bottled up in the House where it just stopped moving. Usually assigned somebody in leadership doesn't like the bill for whatever reason. So today the Senate picked up another bill dealing with uh, waste incineration. And I don't know the specifics of this particular legislation, but it involves some kind of local fight in Miami about the location of a proposed waste incinerator or something like that. As always, I'll throw a link into the show notes of every bill we talk about here. So you could click in, you could click through that and learn more, I'm sure. But anyway, it's a local controversy. And again, it's dealing with waste incineration. The Senate took that bill up and stuck all this plastic preemption stuff onto the bill. This, we just talked about how the Constitution requires laws to be comprised of essentially one subject, right? This was like brazenly unrelated. Like the amendment literally on the Senate floor literally changed the title of this bill from an act relating to waste incineration to an act relating to waste management. They did this on the floor. And Senate Democrats, to their credit, called a point of order on this. This is like this is like the ultimate sicko podcast. You got to be deep in the weeds to care about this. Kudos to you if you've come this far, but man, touch grass. Uh, um, uh, sorry, I'm making myself laugh by essentially mocking myself and anybody who's paying attention to me. Anyway, so the Senate Democrats called a point of order on this because clearly you're breaking the rules by sticking this plastics preemption bill on a waste incineration thing, and Senate Republicans essentially ignored their own rules. They ruled that it fit within the rules, but the ruling was utterly laughable. It was just a reminder that like so often we all kind of like when we're trying to figure out like what's going to pass, what's dead and stuff. We keep thinking about it. And I do this all the time. I'm trying to remember like, well, if it gets stuck here, the rules say it can't come back later, so that means it's dead. No, the rules don't matter in the Florida legislature. We've seen this many times before. When leadership wants something to happen, the rules are not going to stop them. They're just going to choose to read the rules however they need to do it. And so just to bring this back to Publix real quick, I cannot prove that Publix is behind this bill. I mean, in fairness to myself, I haven't actually set out to prove it, but again, some of the state's biggest business front groups are showing up for this bill. The Florida Retail Federation has testified on it. The Florida Chamber of Commerce. Publix is a very influential company in those trade groups. Publix has like a freaking battalion of lobbyists registered on this bill, and also it takes a company with a special amount of juice to make like Republican leadership just like be clown themselves on the Senate floor with this rule situation like they did. Not just anybody can get them to do that. So I suspect someone really important wants this bill to pass. So anyway, Senate stuck this plastics preemption onto this waste incineration bill, and they've fired that off to the House today too. Now, again, we're in this kind of like who knows what's going to happen world because of with this budget stalemate. So all of this stuff might just be dead on arrival. It's possible all this stuff might be collapsing, but you're now in a situation where the House could take these bills up and send them out if they decide to sort of give the Senate president what he wants and give Mosaic and Publix or to be safe to give the Florida Retail Federation what it wants on this stuff. All of that stuff could go if they decide to send it out right now. So these kind of last minute games, as you can see, some really gross stuff can happen. And they are still passing some bills. I'll flag one more for today. This is another one we've talked about. This one actually made it out of the process. This is going to the government. This is Senate Bill 700. This is what Republicans are calling the Florida Farm Bill, and we've talked about this one and a few things for. This is an enormous bill, but there are a couple of like really just sort of gross and slash stupid provisions in there. There is one provision that will ban communities from fluoridating their water. Florida is running headlong back towards the Stone Ages, I guess. This is a thing we are doing. We are governing by conspiracy theory at this point. But so it will ban communities from adding fluoride into their water anymore. Doesn't matter what local voters want on this issue. You don't get, say, the Republican Florida legislatures decided this issue for you. The one that sort of chaps me the most is it also includes a bunch of industry, like long sought industry language that would essentially prohibit plant-based meat, egg, and milk products from using meat, egg, and milk. So the question came up like, what is if this legislation were to go into effect, you know, oat milk would no longer be allowed to call itself oat milk on its label. It'd have to, I think the senator or the House member, oh, this was in the House. The House member said, we think it should be called oat beverage or oat fluid. It's like, as if people are confused as to where oat milk comes from or where soy milk comes from, you know. And this is just like garbage stuff, right? We did a podcast on this not too long ago where last year they banned lab grown meat. This year they're trying to impose all these anti-competitive labeling restrictions, stuff that comes directly from the legacy industries, that come from the dairy industry, come from the cattle industry. This Senate Bill 700, not only does it do all that, it also creates a taxpayer-funded advertising program for the cattle beef industry. This is just like raw intervention into a private market to like crush all these competitors to an industry that you particularly favor. In this case, the beef cattle industry, right? It's just the next time a Florida Republican legislator tells you they support the free market, just laugh in their face and show them this bill because this is as far away from the free market as you could possibly get, but they're going to do it anyway. Um, the good news about this is it's a bit of a clown show in that it's not actually going to take effect. All of this language is contingent on like 11 other states in the South from passing similar bills, and only one other state has passed the milk labeling prohibition. And it sounds like if the legislative sponsors are to be believed, and presumably the lobbyists they're doing this for are giving them good intel, Florida would be the first state to try and impose these labeling restrictions on plant-based meat products. So ultimately, none of this will actually do anything. Um, it's just other than, of course, embarrassing these people and exposing themselves for the actual frauds they are when it comes to claiming to be free market supporters. Um, the other thing that's interesting about this bill is so tucked inside all of this is some legislation that would essentially make it easier for agriculture, for farm companies to build housing, on-site housing for migrant farm work, for seasonal farm workers. This, for what it's worth, I actually think is good legislation. This should happen. This has become a problem in Florida where essentially anti-immigrant zealots, xenophobes, are essentially pressuring local government elected like a county commission when there's like a zoning issue to be able to build, to build a residential structure on a farm property. They're like pressuring their county commissioners and stuff into denying that sort of the same challenge we run into with affordable housing in other contexts where a bunch of NIMBY homeowners will convince county commissioners to reject affordable housing plans. Same thing we just had this in Orlando with a homeless shelter where a bunch of NIMBY people in the neighborhood made sure to kill up plans for a homeless shelter because everybody wants more housing, just they don't want it anywhere near them essentially. And so this bill essentially tries to override local government authority when it comes to building farm worker housing on agricultural property. So I genuinely think that's a pretty good idea. This is a thing that comes from the ag industry. Not all that. Not just to be clear. Not I obviously don't think all ideas that come from these big special interests are bad. I support this one. What this is interesting though is this is a bill essentially that Ron DeSantis vetoed last year. I mean, shock of all shock. The anti-immigrant demagogue governor vetoed this bill. Who could have seen that coming? Now, supporters have tried to sort of use the reasoning Ron DeSantis gave for vetoing it last year. They have tried to address that, and the governor claimed he thought this could become a vehicle for attracting illegal immigrants. So there's more language in here around punishment if illegals are caught using this housing, that sort of thing. I'm going off memory here, so don't hold me to the details of how that language works. The point is they're trying to they've added stuff to this bill to try and address the ostensible reasons Ron DeSantis gave for vetoing this legislation this year. But I got to tell you, it would not surprise me to see Ron DeSantis tank this whole bill over that exact issue. I think that's a big reason why this is loaded up with so many kind of like culture war stuff, with fluoride, with with attacks on Beyond Beef and Impossible Sausage and oat milk. I think we haven't even talked about it. There's some like anti-ESG stuff in this bill. They're doing more of that dumb stuff. All of that, I think, is to try and load this bill up in a way that it becomes very difficult for Ron DeSantis to veto because the ag industry, that's really what it wants in this bill. And so anyway, I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch because I'm not sure, this bill passed by veto-proof margins, but in a situation where if he did veto it, particularly, I would assume if he vetoed it, he'd also be doing some sort of like he'd be inventing some kind of executive action about fluoride or something to make it look like he was taking action on fluoride all himself. Because, obviously nothing we need to sort of get on top of than the problems of fluoride in Florida right now. But presumably if he tanked it, he would have some cover for some of those other culture war issues he would be tanking along with it. And in that situation, I'm not sure that you have the votes on a bill like this to override the governor, because again, you do have those culture war provisions in there. So there's a bunch of Democrats that aren't going to want it. There's going to be a few Republicans at least that probably don't want to go against the governor, and he's going to give them cover to not. So anyway, just an interesting bill to watch. Sort of a testament to just how much Republicans in the Florida legislature seem to like Wilton Simpson, the state's agriculture commissioner. The fact that they, even as everything else is crashing and collapsing, the building is on fire and falling down all around them. They made sure to like run into the building and grab Wilton Simpson's bill and run it out of there before the whole thing collapsed. So, but there is no love lost between Ron DeSantis and Wilton Simpson. So I don't know that this is necessarily the last word on this particular piece of legislation. Of course, I am terrible with these predictions. I also low-key predicted the Florida House of Representatives was going to kill the child labor bill this year, and they not only did not kill it, they passed it. So that's sitting over there in the Senate. So we might have more to say about that later this week. Okay, I've rambled long enough as always. So I'm going to cut it there. We will be back again with some form of update tomorrow. Who knows what it looks like? I was joking with someone today that this has all the hallmarks of, if you got a good bill that's in a position to pass, you need to get it out of there because this thing could blow at any time. Like all good bills evacuate the island. So we will we'll be back tomorrow and see where things stand. So otherwise, thanks for listening. As always, click like and subscribe, leave a comment or a review. And if you haven't already, think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter. Subscriptions are free, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for one if you've got the means to do so. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. All right, we'll leave it there and talk again very soon. Take care.